Deep within the crumbling remains of the occupied territories of the great southern land, one man has discovered that not only has his paranoid nightmares become a reality, he is also completely all out of bubble gum. Put on those sunglasses and take a glimpse behind the curtain of control as we join our host, live from an undisclosed location, Mr. David Russell.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Out of Bubblegum. I do believe this is episode number 10. Ed, tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is episode number 10 of All Out of Bubblegum. Broadcasting to you from the prison state of Victoria, Australia, the lockdown restriction propaganda SJW boot camp of the world. And here we are coming to you. Hello, Al. It's nice to have you on. Love your work. Here we are bringing you episode number 10 of All Out of Bubblegum. Ed, if you'd be so kind, shall we let 1 week in the flu world order roll? And we'll get... Indeed, it's been one more week in the flu world order, that twilight zone of a place where time flies and yet oddly stands still at the same moment. So it's been a busy week. I have just sorted through the numerous things that friends and acquaintances send me, and I thank them for all their correspondence and information. I thought this week we might start off 1 week in the flu world order, focusing on the fifth estate, the world of the legacy dinosaur mainstream media, and I would argue actually the vast bulk of the alternative media as well. I'm not a fan of the legacy media. I have not been a fan of them and their work for a long time, but there's quite a few items today that I think we can start off with that focus on the nefarious, duplicitous and propagandistic nature of the fifth estate, and I guess we can focus on an area that you could call bought journalists. In fact, there's even a book, Gekaufte Journalisten, German for bought journalists. We're not going to go into depth with this book, although maybe sometime we will. So many books and so little time. But this is Udo Aufkoder's book, Bought Journalists. And we're going to focus on just how bought they are today. Ed, if you could bring up that story one more time. Thank you so much. British watchdog journalists unmasked as lapdogs for the security state. Yes, indeed. So there's been a defamation trial proceeding in the UK. I believe a businessman called Paul Banks was suing two journalists in the UK for defamation. And what has come out through the process of that trial in the UK. Thank you, Ed. There's the research. There's the article down below if you want to read it yourself, which I always recommend you do. What has come out in the smoke and mirrors of that trial is a whole cache of emails from these two journalists. One is from The Guardian, my pet hate of all media outlets. And another one of the journalists is from the BBC, who'd be right up near the top of the list for me too. And these emails, which have been introduced in this trial, have implicated them very clearly, both of those journalists, as stooges of fronts for the intelligence agencies. And in fact, a lot of those emails, and the article goes into depth about them, have these journalists, I'm going to do some air quotes there, these journalists who are very intimate with intelligence figures, and they correspond with them quite regularly, also spend a lot of their time trying to drag down, defame, puncture, wound, marginalize, and sideline alternative journalists, which I think is an interesting thing, isn't it? So these two journalists in particular, this one from The Guardian, sorry to swear, and the BBC, spend an inordinate amount of time trying to drag independent journalists who are going against the narrative, try and disrupt or destroy their careers, or tar them in various fashions. And there's an awful lot of correspondence that goes on between these journalists, very bulbous air quotes there, and these shadowy figures who are at the very least at the margins of the intelligence community, and looking and strategizing about ways to discredit independent journalists who are pointing out holes in their narrative on various issues. These two journalists spend a lot of time, an incredible amount of time. You would imagine they wouldn't have much time to do much of anything else, the amount of time they spend on being, as the headline mentioned, lapdogs for the security state. Now, this is not, unfortunately, an unusual situation. And in fact, I would suggest to you my view of certainly the legacy media and large swathes of the so-called alternative media, as I honestly view them as basically tentacles of the security state. I think if you view them in that way, or I certainly find it to be the case, if I view them as tentacles of the security state, of the forces of darkness, of the so-called intelligence community, or whatever it might be behind those scenes, then their actions, then what they say and what they do makes a lot more sense. It's a lot more understandable for me if I view the legacy media in particular through that lens of just being simply tentacles of the intelligence agencies. And I think they've got a long history of that, but the last 2 years, I believe, has made that fairly self-evident. Ed, if you wouldn't mind, here's item number 2, another story that comes originally out of Paris, France, and that is about a French journalist, big, thick air quotes. He was actually a sort of a writer, sort of ghostwriter character, who was commissioned by an agency to ghostwrite, I believe he said, upwards of 600 articles. Thanks, Ed. There's a link below, which through various pseudonyms and fake names and other sorts of other chicanery appeared in the press in France and around the world. And they were basically front articles for various corporate interests. A lot of it was, in his case, was defending Roundup, the Monsanto chemical, which there is a lot of evidence that it's incredibly dangerous. He spent a lot of his time writing press articles debunking people who had questions about it or concerns about it, and pumping up that, and also all sorts of other political activities. And this fellow, in the end, though he said he was making good money from this activity, very good money indeed, he said, his conscience couldn't bear to do this anymore. So he went public and admitted that he had been paid by a public relations agency to author upwards of 600 press articles that appeared in the press, which were simply press juggernauts for various corporations. If you've existed outside the media, this may come as a surprise to you. If you've ever lived or worked anywhere within the media, this, you may not want to discuss it, but this won't really surprise you. Years and years and years ago, a long time ago, I had a radio show in Melbourne, and I noticed, even in just my little neck of the woods on a community radio station, I noticed that in those days we had pigeonholes, and our pigeonholes sometimes would be stuffed with press releases from government departments or whatever nonsense. And I would often correlate yesterday's press release with today's news stories, and they would be almost identical. Sometimes the paragraphs might be changed around in order a little bit, or some sort of cosmetic changes, or quotes might be attributed in slightly different wording or whatever, but they were essentially identical. So most certainly, if you've been outside of this media apparatus, you may not know it, but so much of what goes on is simply just rewriting press releases from official sources. And I would suggest to you that the last 2 years has made it plain to probably anyone who's watching this right now, and it certainly should have made it plain to almost everybody, that official sources are far less than reputable at the best of times. In fact, they may be attempting to murder you and or enslave you. Anyway, let's keep moving. Ed, item number 3, if you will, comes out of the UK, and I'm bringing this to your attention because it is linked to what I've just been discussing. In fact, everything on today's show is connected in some fashion. Though I won't point out all those connections to you. I assume you are sentient enough to make those connections yourself. But I would point out that a couple of years ago, and I don't have the information in front of me, but a couple of years ago, there were admittedly draconian national security laws were passed in Australia that made it illegal, even for journalists, even for so-called journalists, to report deliberately or accidentally on what, and I can't remember the exact precise wording, but they were sort of official operations or protected operations or something like this, spook activity, intelligence agency activity, federal police activity, anything that they had declared to be a protected operation. You could not report on that, even though there was no way in theory or in practice for a journalist to know what a protected operation was, what activities were protected and what weren't. If they even inadvertently or accidentally reported on anything connected to any of these activities, they could face 5 to 10 years in jail. Now, I don't, that's kind of Soviet era kind of chilling of free speech, if ever I've seen it in operation. That was passed in Australia about 3 or 4 years ago, I think, not coincidentally. But I wanted to draw your attention to this historical parallel, and Australia has had, innocent, sun-bronzed Aussie paradise, the lucky country, has since 1971 at least had a secret official government department of propaganda. There's been some declassified documents that this UK website have poured over. I haven't seen any mention of this in Australia whatsoever, or in the Australian press whatsoever. I think you can understand why. They wouldn't dare touch it with a barge pole. But somebody in the UK has gone through these documents and, seen evidence that Australia has had a secret but official propaganda department since at least 1971. This department was set up with the input, or basically was set up by MI6, UK intelligence, and it's been operating in Australia since 1971. It's not clear from the documents if that secret official government department was ever dissolved at any point. That's not clear, but it was set up in 1971. So there is an official department in Australia for lying to the population. So there are bureaucrats and others on the official payroll in Australia, and their job description is to lie to you. And I hate to say it again, but I think the last 2 years should have made that really, really, really plain. So that is the Gekaufte Journalisten, the bought journalists. This book, I just should quickly mention, has a very interesting history, and it's a very interesting book. It was published in an English translation, which disappeared. You couldn't buy a copy for love or for money. In fact, the only copies that I ever saw were supposedly $5,000 each. That would tend to lead you to believe that they pressed such a tiny amount of copies that they essentially vanished. There is now another English translation of that book with a far more colourful title and artwork, Prostitutes Embedded in the Pay of the CIA. It's the same book, it's just a translation of the German one. The German one has a long and sordid recounting of the ways that all sorts of very high profile, and it's all about German journalists, essentially from memory, about how all sorts of very high profile journalists working for the biggest, most important media organs in Europe were in the pay of intelligence agencies or agencies linked to NATO and the Atlantic Alliance and these other shadowy sort of NATO-y intelligence-like bodies, and they were directly paid by them often, and they would often have articles submitted to them, these journalists. They were given articles that were written by others, spooks, and that those articles would be published under their names, under their bylines in the the biggest newspapers in Germany. And Germany's equivalent of like the Wall Street Journal and all these kind of things. And these articles, hundreds of them, were simply submitted to these journalists by the intelligence agencies, and then they would be published under their names. I would suggest to you that that is going on everywhere, and that would explain the cheerleading from our media organs of tyranny and totalitarianism. They either look the other way when you would think that nobody could miss what's going on, or they cheerlead it. So yes, there's the bought journalists. Let's move on. Number 4, just wanted to retouch on something that I did mention last week, and I won't go into as much detail as I did last week, but this is what they would call an evolving story. Sorry for the multi-level puns in there. This evolving story is the continued decline that is now being noted in birth rates around the world. Taiwan, for various reasons, appears to be the canary in the coal mine. Thank you, Ed. Their birth rate in Taiwan has now dropped by 27.66%, so almost 28%. That is a massive decline in birth rates. I'm going to suggest to you that there's a very obvious reason for that decline, a coerced medical intervention. And there is a control group. I mean, there's the obvious control group, But there's also there's a control country that you can control next to, because some people might suggest, well, it might have been a byproduct. This drop in birth rates might have been a byproduct of lockdowns and restrictions, blah, 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 all that nonsense. But there is a control country that you can compare to, which is Sweden, which did not have lockdowns and those style of restrictions. And the birth rate is also free falling in Sweden as well. So I would suggest that that indicates that the most likely culprit for those massive declines in birth rates is a certain coerced medical intervention. Just trying to not get nuked. If we can possibly manage that, it's always a little bit of a whack-a-mole game, isn't it? Yes, just trying to dodge the whack-a-mole at all times. Ed, item number 5, if you would be so kind. The safe and effective narrative is falling apart. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I would recommend this article from Steve Kirsch's newsletter to you. It lists 48, I believe, reasons why the safe and effective narrative is absolutely crumbling to pieces. All 48 of those reasons are compelling, and you might want to have them, you might in fact find them interesting, but you also might want to keep them handy for discussing with friends and family if that opportunity raises itself. So I won't go into them in detail, but that's pretty handy there if you want to avail yourself of that information. Another item that I thought was very much of interest was this article, item number 6. Ed, I'm also not going to go into great detail about this, but I did want to point out something that was very interesting in this piece, and I have heard of before, and possibly some of you have heard of before, but I thought it was worth mentioning again, and that is the ASH experiment. And I do believe, Ed, we have an image for the ASH experiment in there somewhere. That was one of these sort of psychological experiments that was conducted in the US in the 1950s. They all smell a bit like MK Ultra to me. I don't believe that they were officially under the MK Ultra umbrella, but they all smell a lot like MK Ultra to me, the secret mind control programs and investigations. Anyway, the ASH experiment was this is relevant to what we've been discussing this show, and in fact is relevant to an awful lot of things, actually, and things that we will be discussing shortly. The ASH experiment, it is very interesting. It's basically what they did in this experiment is they sat down at a table of people, like let's say 8 people, and out of those 8 people, 7 of those 8 people were actors. They were paid stooges, if you will, and there was one person there who was what you could call the experimental subject of this study, of this experiment. And so someone would propose, someone off the table would ask a question or propose something that was patently ridiculous. But these 7 actors sitting around the table would all agree with this patently ridiculous assertion. And then the one person who wasn't a paid actor and didn't know that the others were paid actors, the innocent party in this experiment, in fact, the experimental subject, would, I think it was in about 70-something% of the time, 70 to 80% of the time, they would agree with the rest of the group, no matter what, no matter how absurd whatever was being proposed was. This is what you could describe as groupthink. This is groupthink, and I would suggest to you that the forces of darkness know intimately the power of groupthink, and that is why they constantly use things like polling to tell you what everyone else is supposedly thinking, so you know what you need to go along with. Oh, everyone else is thinking this thing. Oh, well, I guess I better think that too. There are all sorts of tools that are used, which I would suggest have been developed downstream of the Asch experiment. And the media is an incredible instrument in this regard. It's constantly telling you supposedly what everyone thinks. You'll often see headlines of where we think this, or this is what's going to happen to you, or there's this constant air of groupthink in the media, and that serves the purpose of people who have questions, even the most straightforward and logical and common sense questions are, of course, marginalized. And that is also why, for example, and there are so many examples of this, you might see certain figures around certain medical interventions, which are around the supposed uptake of these medical interventions, which are simply not credible. They're not believable. The numbers of people who have supposedly taken these medical interventions are simply not credible. I've never believed them from day one, but they do serve the purposes like the Asch experiment. If you're the one single person, you're the odd man out on this table of public opinion, it's built into people. 70 to 80% of people will agree with whatever's being said by the group, no matter how stupid it is, no matter how absurd it is, no matter how much it even goes against their own particular personal interests. These experiments in the 1950s showed that people will go along with it, and that is the power of groupthink. That is the power of the mob. The mob, the tribe. 70 to 80% of people will go along with most things, no matter how ridiculous they may seem. So I would suggest that we're kind of living in a sort of open air Asch experiment. And I think the numbers of people who've taken the nefarious clot shots is much smaller, significantly smaller than what we're told. And I think the numbers of people who have questions or are resisting or are doubtful of the narrative is much larger than what we are told. And we are told those lies for a number of reasons, but one of those reasons very clearly is the Asch experiment. If you want people to comply, to be obedient, put them in a group that enforces this group cohesion, even if it's based on things that are fundamentally untrue. The Asch experiment, really, really interesting stuff. There's also the what's his name, Stanley Milgram experiments. There's all sorts of these experiments that in psychology that were conducted in the 1950s that I think have been weaponized against us as a community. I think we are, as I said, I think we are living in an open air Asch and Stanley Milgram and the rest of it experiment. Be aware, the best defense against these kind of things, I would suggest, is knowledge, is information. And if you have some inkling of how they are attempting to manipulate you, you're much better prepared to defend yourself from that manipulation. Anyway, Ed, item number 7, if you would, I just thought this was interesting. This is blatantly obvious, but I am amused by the way that they sort of begrudgingly admit the odd little thing. Yes, record numbers of people have left the state of Victoria, Australia. I can't imagine why. Over the last year or two, record numbers of people have left the state. I'm perplexed as to why that might be. I mean, we've seen, police shooting peaceful demonstrators with rubber bullets. We've seen them bring out armored vehicles onto the streets of our cities. We've seen communications blackouts. We've seen that building union protest, the second one in the CBD of Melbourne, where people could not get phone reception, and there was all sorts of, I think, reasonably credible allegations of a communications blackout in the city while that protest was going on, and they were pulling out their armored vehicles and all the rest of it. You add up that, and of course the most revolting aspect of it to me, but it's got lots of competition, was the vaccine mandates, which I think, as I've said before on this show, they didn't even try that one in the Soviet Union. We're way ahead of the Soviet Union on that one. There we go. Yes, that's just another day in Victoria, Australia. Nothing to see there. Move along, as they might have said in a different time. Yeah, that's where we're at, and that's we're going to have to deal with that. Now, for a in one fashion, a little bit of light relief. In one fashion, and I know he's gone. Actually, Ed, can you pull up the Get Me Another One cartoon? I know this idiot's gone. I don't have any time for any of these puppet fools. Boris Johnson is supposedly gone. I mean, who cares? As this excellent cartoon makes clear, Klaus, or whoever's really running this show, will simply just get another puppet out of the play box. But just before Boris was removed, my assumption, it's got nothing to do with whether he partied during lockdowns or not. I mean, as if the media would care, and any of them would care about any of this stuff. I mean, they're all onto it, involved in some degree or another. Obviously, Boris was underperforming in some regard. I hear from people in the ground in the UK that the tyranny, is not really washing in the UK. So perhaps Boris is being replaced by someone who will follow orders a bit more closely. But I thought just before he left, this was interesting and chilling at the same time. Boris Johnson wants multi-generational mortgages so parents can pass on debt to children. Yes, they're serious. They're having discussions, and they're advancing the idea that people will be able to go into multi-generational mortgages. That is mortgages that might go for 50 or 60 years. That's generally accepted as being beyond one person's ability to pay it back, so the debt will be passed on to their children. Sounds a little bit like slavery to me. You take on some debt to buy some overpriced home of some sort. The bank extracts, basically 3 times the amount of money that you borrow out of you, and then you pass on that debt to your children. These people are actually serious. You will owe nothing and you will be happy. They're really coming for the whole set, aren't they? They really want to murder or enslave. Anyway, talking about Klaus, he's irresistible as a character, as a ridiculous Bond villain. It's hard to take your eyes off the train wreck that is Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum. I thought we'd have a little entertaining interlude here. Ed, if you could pull up that video. This is from a couple of years back. Here's our Nicole eating the bugs.
I'm Nicole Kidman, and I am going to eat a 4-course meal of bugs. I am here to reveal my hidden talent, eating micro livestock, cornworms. They're still alive. Extraordinary. Very moist, chewy. Can't quite describe the flavor, but need a little water. Let's try the second course, shall we? Just a little side note. 2 billion people in the world eat bugs, and I'm one of them. Because here we go. Have some mealworms. I'm telling you, I'd win Survivor. That is a fruity taste. I'd recommend it. Here we have. Oh, crickets. Oh, nothing. Oh, awesome. Like nothing you've ever tasted. Like a hairy nut. Don't. Oh my gosh. A nut from the shell. And now for dessert. The fried grasshopper. These are amazing. These are exquisite grasshoppers. I recommend them to anyone. Thank you for spending so much time with me and watching me eat bugs. Till next time.
Extraordinary. Ed, do you actually think she ate any of those bugs? I'm not convinced.
Can I butt in for a second? Can I
What's
butt in
that?
for a second? It's very interesting that they're using old freak show stunts. Like,
Yeah.
first off, the PCR trick, which is the old human blockhead of hammering a nail into your head, and eating bugs was an old standby on the sideshows. Just thought I'd add my 2 bits. Back to the show.
What do you make of that?
They're just taking the piss. They're
They're
mocking
taking the
us.
piss.
It's mockery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're carny tricks, aren't they? They're carny tricks.
Yep. That's exactly what they are.
Yeah, it's razzle and dazzle of the show. You know, it's showbiz magic, isn't it? Really, it's incredible.
Indeed.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that she actually ate the bugs. I noticed that the edits there's always an edit to a wide shot when she's actually eating the things, so you can't really tell what they are. You know,
She didn't stick her tongue out with a dead bug on it. So yeah.
No. But also, if she is eating the bugs, you know, I mean, sure, she's Nicole Kidman, but I mean, so what? She's just another puppet. She's just another prostitute, isn't she? Basically, you know, I mean, if she is eating the bugs, they're just humiliating their little playthings like they humiliate the rest of us. Anyway, that's from a few years back. So I think it's interesting that they've been working on that agenda for a bit of a while, I'd say. And they want to humiliate us. Okay, yeah. And neither am I. I'm with you. I'm not. Yeah, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'm not convinced about any of that stuff. Anyway, was interesting, that's for sure. Let's move on. Time for my favorite.
Draw the curtains and expand your mind. It's time to get textual as we traverse the illicit pages of Wrongthink in the Forbidden Book Club.
Yes, indeed. It's time for the Forbidden Book Club, my favorite part of the show. As I've confessed to you before, and I'll confess to you again, I'm bookish. I'm a book nerd. I like transgressive literature. I like things that simmer away on the margins, that ask the difficult questions. And so today I wanted to talk about a very, very, very interesting book. It's called Terror on the Tube Behind the Veil of 7/7, an investigation. Now, this relates to the bombings that took place on the London underground rail system on the 7th of July 2005. So essentially 17 years ago. You may ask, as you have every right to ask, what's the relevance of this? Why are we discussing this book today, Terror on the Tube? And I would advance the proposition to you that there's a number of reasons why this is relevant, and I think they'll become fairly obvious. But the very first one that I want to suggest to you why this is still relevant today is, in fact, its absence. The absence. Cast your mind back 3 years. This is very telling and very important in my view. Cast your mind back, if you can, 3 years before the current psychological trauma operation, and cast your mind back to one of the previous psychological trauma operations, the supposed war on terror and all these terrorist attacks that happened. I mean, they were uncountable at some stages. The numbers of them that were going on around the world, even in sleepy, stupid Australia, Europe, the US, etc., 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 all over the place. There was this rash of these supposedly Islamic terror attacks. It was never very clear what the precise motivation for them was actually, really, supposedly. I am going to suggest to you that all of these attacks were fraudulent on at least one level. I'm not alleging that they didn't happen or that people weren't injured or killed in them necessarily, but what I'm alleging to you, the fraudulent aspect of these terrorist attacks, is who was ultimately behind them. That is the part that I would suggest is the fraudulent bit. And I would note, when I said just before that I think right now the most relevant part of the war on terror is its absence. The fact that it disappeared overnight, actually. That simply somebody flicked a switch and the war on terror disappeared, and what I would call the war on humanity, the COVID farce, began almost overnight. These terrorist attacks, which were omniscient in the media ecosphere. You could not go anywhere without hearing about them. Terror, fear, bombings, shootings, silly duffers with explosives in their underwear or in their shoes, or all sorts of things which are patently ridiculous, really. Almost as ridiculous as all that footage out of Wuhan from 2.5 years ago. All of a sudden, this narrative, be terrorized, be frightened of the bombs, blah, 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 all these ridiculous, even up here in the hillbilly central nowheresville, you started to have these bins at train stations that were replaced with transparent see-through bins so that, Osama bin Laden wouldn't put his bombs at the regional train station, and all this sort of idiotic nonsense, concrete bollards everywhere, blah, blah, blah. All this terrorism theater to terrorize the population and justify all sorts of draconian national security laws that would rob people of the most basic vestiges and illusions of freedom and rights that they might think that they had, and would be used to push through all sorts of surveillance, overreach, and biosecurity laws. All sorts of nefarious things were all done in the guise of a response to terrorism, which all of a sudden, when a different operation started, it all disappeared, gone. I would suggest to you, it's my theory that apart from anything else, that strongly suggests that the people who were running this operation, and I sincerely believe it was an operation, are also running the current operation, and that they know that they coordinate, and they know that they can't really terrorize the population from multiple angles all at once, because they'll probably just collapse into quivering messes. So the fear campaigns have to be strategic, they have to be directed, they have to come from, you know, finite, deliberate points. And then when you're done with this one, the terrorism psychological warfare operation, then you can move on to the next one, the COVID one, or the food chain collapse one, or the inflation one, or the blah, 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 whatever's coming next down the pike. So now I'm assuming some of you are aware of these ideas and have your own suspicions about these activities. For some of you, this may be a new idea. So I understand that. It may not have been of interest to you or whatnot, but this book, it really is. I highly recommend it to you. It's still fascinating reading. It's written by this fellow here, Nicholas Kollerstrom. He was once upon a time a respected scientific historian in the UK. He was a member of the Royal Society. You can't get much more insider than that. But then he deviated from the path. He left the reservation and started writing books like this and other books which are even less acceptable and more off the reservation than this one. And so now he's a complete outcast, this fellow. So in this book, he digs up all sorts of, you know, some of them are reasonably obvious holes in the official narrative. Like all these operations, if you poke the official narrative hard enough, it tends to fall over. It's just a facade, you know, built to corral, you know, that percentage of the population who are unquestioning, who have no questions to ask whatsoever of any authority or official sources. If you ask questions and you poke these narratives, they tend to be full of holes and they tend to fall over pretty easily, really. And so the author asks some pretty common sense questions and asks for pretty straightforward evidence, and he essentially demolishes the official story. So the official story, if you cast your mind back, you may remember this. It was in London. It was in 2005. There were 3 underground trains that bombs went off in. I think supposedly 52 people died. You saw photos of the train carriages. It looked horrific. A bus above ground, obviously a bus also had a bomb placed on it. And I do believe, if I remember correctly, 52 people died and a lot of people were injured in these horrific attacks. But there are questions. There we go. There's the bus that I think was the number 30 bus from Piccadilly, had a bomb on the top story and blew the top of the bus off. Interestingly, exactly, thank you, my correspondent. I was going to say, yes, in Tavistock Square in London, I believe out the front of the Tavistock Institute. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Somebody's trying to send us a signal. And that bus also, and I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes, but that bus also had a film, an ad for a film called, I think it was The Descent, on the side of the ad, which on the side of the bus, and the ad's tagline was, you know, dizzying descent into horror and terror or something like this, which is interesting, isn't it? Almost like it's all designed as some sort of psychological operation. Anyway, that happened in Tavistock Square. Anyway, to cut to the chase, and I'm just going to, you should read this book yourself if you're at all interested. I'm just going to pluck out 3 examples where Kollerstrom shows that the official narrative falls to bits or looks highly dubious when you pull it apart, okay, even in the most sort of simple fashion. Now, the first of those is a fellow called Peter Power, who on the day of those attacks, the 7th of July, 2005, that's right, Ed, this fellow here, Peter Power, who was a former policeman and a former soldier, and was working in Scotland Yard's anti-terrorism branch. He had gone private by 2005 and had his own company called Visor Consultants, who worked on real-time crisis management, wargaming activities and these sorts of situations for corporations and companies and so forth. On the day of the attacks, on the afternoon of the attacks, Peter Power went on the BBC. They'd invited him on for some interesting reason, and he there's his WikiSpooks entry. It's a very interesting website, WikiSpooks, a good resource actually. He went on the BBC the afternoon of the attacks and said, very interestingly, that day, that very morning, at 9 o'clock in the morning, precisely when these bombs had in fact gone off on the London Underground, he was running an exercise that very morning in London, a tabletop exercise, an anti-terrorism crisis management exercise, where they had were in hypothetically responding to 3 bombings that were in fact the exact same stations that were bombed in the real world scenario at exactly the same time. That is very, very interesting. I think Peter Power, for whatever reasons, and possibly it was to protect himself, let the cat out of the bag there, possibly deliberately, and drew people's attention to the fact that they were running a drill at exactly the same time, in exactly the same places, with exactly the same bombing events occurring at exactly the same time. They were running this drill. Isn't that interesting? That's also happened on 9/11, and many of these other terrorist events have had drills with the basic, or in fact the identical scenario happening at the same time. And that is a pretty good way to mask or hide your preparations to run one of these events. I'm suggesting to you is to run in parallel, concurrently run a drill, so that you can have people in position. You can be organizing resources and all sorts of things, and all of a sudden the drill goes live and you've got your terrorist event. Really, it's a common playbook in these terrorism attacks, that there is a concurrent parallel drill happening at the same time. And I would suggest to you, if they ever bring back this war on terror nonsense, which they may well do if they run out of other scams, if there's any sign of a drill happening nearby, I'd exit the building immediately if I were you. So Peter Power also appeared, I think, almost exactly a year before these bombings on the London Underground. Peter Power, coincidentally, appeared on a program on the BBC, Panorama. It's a well-known program on the BBC, and he was involved in this sort of panel discussion, this sort of anti-terrorism, or this sort of terrorism simulation that was almost, again, identical to what happened in the real world a year later. 3 bombs on 3 tube trains. There he is. That's a screen grab of Peter Power, almost exactly a year beforehand on the BBC program Panorama. That is almost identical to the scenario that happens in the real world a year later. Isn't that interesting? I've actually got the quote from Peter Power that he said on the BBC that afternoon of the attacks. I'm going to read it to you because I think it's very, very interesting. And this is a quote from Peter Powell. That the afternoon of the attacks. At 9:30 this morning, we were actually running an exercise for a company of over 1,000 people in London based on simultaneous bombs going off precisely at the railway stations where it happened this morning. He went on to say that it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, being involved in an operation that was almost identical to the thing that happened in the real world. I'm going to suggest to you that that is highly, highly suspicious. As I said just a few moments ago, this is a typical situation in these terrorist attacks. There are drills that are almost identical running concurrently. Of course, you have to have, in an operation like this, you have to have patsies. There were 4 Islamic young gentlemen who were fingered as the patsies. They were all supposedly suicide bombers, so they're all dead, so they can't defend themselves, obviously. That's always a very convenient thing. So Nick Colostrum pulls apart the narrative, the official narrative, and he pulls it apart sometimes in devastating fashion. So the government agencies and the media, they're almost the same thing, aren't they? Released a whole narrative around these bombings, saying that these 4 gentlemen had left on a train from Luton, I think it was, parked the cars in the Luton train station car park, whatever, got on a 7:40 a.m. train from Luton to, I guess it was King's Cross in London. The media said that I agree. The media said that they had the best. They had the surveillance footage, CCTV images of these fellows entering the stations, time stamped at the right times. They even released stills from this surveillance footage from the train stations, time stamped with supposedly these 4 gentlemen entering Luton Station at the time to catch their 7:40 train. They built this whole narrative. This was the official story, that they'd been on this 7:40 a.m. train from Luton. They'd got off at King's Cross. There was more stills released from surveillance footage showing them leaving the station, or walking through King's Cross Station as they got off the 7:40 a.m. train. It was time stamped, and it all corresponded, so forth. This whole narrative was built and repeated by the media ad nauseum, blah, 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 to build up in people's minds the guilt of these young fellows. There was just one problem. Nick Colostrum, the author of this book, went to, I think he went to King's Cross Station, and he spoke to somebody there in person, asking them for their schedule that morning of the trains, and whether they'd been delayed or there are any cancellations and this kind of thing. And the helpful person at the train station gave him the train station's official rundown of how, if there were any delayed trains that day or any cancellations. And there were many that morning. In fact, all the trains coming in from Luton were heavily delayed sometimes by half an hour or so, which already blows out their whole narrative of all. Don't forget, these images released to the media were time stamped. Ouch. And also the very, very interesting information that the 7:40 a.m. train that morning that they caught to King's Cross so that they could let off their bombs on the trains and kill all these people and do all these horrible things, that train was cancelled that morning. And there were multiple witnesses who said they were waiting for the 7:40 a.m. train from Luton and that it was indeed cancelled. So you had 2 informational points there, 2 data points there. Not only was there the official rundown from the train station saying the 7:40 a.m. train was cancelled, you also had witnesses who said the train was cancelled. I couldn't get it. I had to get a later train to London, which made me late for work, blah, 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 blah. So Colostrum wrote this in his book. don't think for a moment that the powers that be, that shouldn't be, aren't paying attention to this sort of stuff. They immediately, and in Parliament in the UK, had to deconstruct their, rather embarrassingly, had to deconstruct their narrative and their timeline, discard all those photos that were time-stamped with times that only corresponded to them getting on that particular train. I know I'm going into a lot of detail here, but I think it's important that you understand how this whole narrative that they constructed with all sorts of evidence was blown apart instantly. By this book, Colostrum actually has the timetables in here, the cancellations. He reproduces them in here. All the information's in the book. It blew apart their whole official narrative. They had to hurriedly reconstruct another one, which was even more stupid, in a very embarrassing fashion. And the third point that I wanted to raise about that, and that's surely that's enough already to ask serious questions about these kind of events. But the third one, and I remember this very clearly from the time, is there were reports in the earliest media reports, which are always the most interesting ones. They're the least filtered ones, the least controlled ones, was that 3 potential suicide bombers had been shot by the police or special branch at Canary Wharf in London about I think an hour after the bomb supposedly went off. So there's all sorts of questions already in there. I remember seeing news reports in the print media at the time saying that there were witnesses who had said that at Canary Wharf in London, which has got a lot of swanky high-rise buildings and a lot of media are there, these three of these supposed suicide bombers who's been supposedly blown themselves to bits on these trains were actually shot out in front of these buildings by snipers, by police snipers, anti-terrorist unit snipers. And the people in the buildings were told not to look out of the buildings. They were not allowed to look out the windows. They had to move away from the windows as far as they could while that scene was cleaned up. And that went on for a number of hours. That story, which I personally saw with my own eyes in the online print media, the Guardian or the Age or wherever I saw it, that story then just disappeared. It was gone. A few hours later, it was gone. And as Colostrum builds in his book very convincingly, and as I actually thought at the time myself, what's going on here? It sounds like they've had some patsies who've gone off reservation. In fact, they've missed their train. Let's just assume for a moment they were probably part of some sort of training exercise. They'd probably been recruited for some sort of training exercise, anti-terrorism training exercise. These young men, probably in their innocence, thought they were cooperating with the police or the intelligence agencies or, MI5 or whoever. In their innocence, they thought that they were being good representatives of their community and cooperating with authorities. This is my suggestion, my hypothesis for what happened. I would suggest these 4 gentlemen thought they were involved in an anti-terrorism drill. Their train, however, to be on time for that drill and to be part of that drill was cancelled. By the time they actually got to King's Cross, mayhem had ensued, bombs had gone off, and I think it's quite credible to suggest that they panicked, realizing that perhaps they were about to be painted as patsies. The phones were down in London at the time, surprise, surprise, so they couldn't really communicate with anybody. So perhaps they thought, right, well, we'll go to the ITV office or BBC or whoever's in Canary Wharf, an independent newspaper or whoever's there at the time, and we'll talk to some journalists and tell them that it wasn't us, we weren't on these trains, blah, 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 perhaps just to tell their story and protect themselves. They might have just smelt a rat. So when you've got patsies who are on the loose, you need to get rid of them immediately. and I would suggest perhaps a squad of snipers was sent in to commit an executive action and remove those very embarrassing patsies who are still alive. There's also all sorts of other things in this book that blow apart the official narrative. Like I said, with all of these things, you push that narrative and it falls to pieces, okay? The same with this COVID farce, the same with all of these things. You push hard enough and they all fall over, okay? There's plenty of other things in the book. I won't, I can't go on forever in detail about them, but other things that come to mind is that supposedly these fellows were carrying backpacks, and they were carrying backpacks, but probably the patsies had nothing of consequence in their backpacks. But the official story was that they were carrying these backpacks and committed suicide bombings in the trains. But many of the witnesses, people who survived the bombings, said that the blasts actually occurred from under the train carriages, not from inside them. And in fact, I've seen photos that show that the blasts have erupted from underneath, through the floors of the train carriages. So in fact, the bombs were underneath the trains in the, wheel carriage, not inside the trains. I think that's a fundamental issue. The trains, the remains, the wreckage of those affected train carriages was taken away and destroyed almost immediately. It's a bit like 9/11 and the remains of the buildings being taken away and destroyed as quickly as possible. Tampering and, in fact, destroying a crime scene is a pretty obvious sign of guilt from those responsible, I would suggest. Anyway, that's Terror on the Tube. It's relevant because the war on terror has vanished for 2.5 years. Remember, you were cast your mind back. It's not always easy, I know, but if you cast your mind back, you were meant to be terrorized by our Islamic friends, and all of a sudden, boom, that operation's over, and we change gears, and it's time for the next operation. Anyway, the fellow who wrote this book, Nick Colostrom, really recommends, if you're more of a video person than a book person, I'm a book person, he recommends a video called 7 of the 7th Ripple Effect. I haven't seen it, so I can't pass comment on it, but Colostrom highly recommends it. So if you're a video person, not so much of a book person, perhaps you might want to track down that video. There's an address for it there. Thank you, Ed. It's called 7th of the 7. That's a 7/7 Ripple Effect. Colostrom highly recommends it. It independently comes to many of the same conclusions as he did, apparently. I haven't seen it, but he does recommend it very, very highly indeed. So if you're interested in further information, of which there is a great deal, you might want to have a look at that. You poor long-suffering souls, I feel that I've probably gone on for long enough now. So let's call it a day there. Let's pack up stumps, and I will bid you farewell from All Out of Bubblegum, episode number 10. Until same bat time, same bat channel next week. Look after yourselves. Think clearly. Be brave. Don't be frightened, because they want you to be frightened. So always, this is one of my little personal maxims. Do whatever. Don't do what they want. They have to be frightened and disabled and useless. Be the opposite of all those things. If they want you to follow all their stupid rules and their stupid laws, good people break bad laws. I should probably stop right now, shouldn't I? Just don't do what they want. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you for watching All Out of Bubblegum, episode 10. We will see you next time. Thank you. Thank you, Ed.